States teaching. And prior to that, I was moving around in multiple different places. So I won't bore you with a long history. What I will tell you is that when I was, I've been kind of a rebel. When I was 16, I left home and I wanted to explore. I wanted to find out. I wanted to know the world. I wanted to know what it was about. And that curiosity took me to multiple places. Took me to El Salvador, Honduras, Mexico. I made my way up to the US, and for the last 34 years here in Canada. And I was telling John that when I applied to come to Canada, the consulate insisted for me to go to Vancouver, and I wanted to go to Toronto, and she insisted. But Vancouver, there's no snow there. Why would you want to go to a place where it snows? And since I had already been in Lubbock, Texas for a year, I was fairly familiar with snow, and I loved snow. I do not like the hot weather. You see, when I was in Guatemala, I used to walk with a bag of ice on my head when it was really hot. So I don't know why. I think in another iteration of my life, I was born in a cold place. And so this is kind of me wanting to go back to that cold place. And so that's why I am in Toronto, where it snows, it gets humid. I don't want to add a descriptor to that one, but it gets really humid. And so I'm glad to be there. And now I am here with you all. So bear with me as I talk a little bit about culture, the gospel, and theology. And my hope is that along the way, if there is something that I'm saying that makes absolutely no sense, please raise your hand and tell me, Nestor, you are making no sense. Believe me, I am not going to take it personal. Well, I might. I won't tell you. But anyway, but please ask me, and I'll try to be as clear as possible. All right? So today, my hope is that we're going to do these several things. On one hand, we're going to talk about culture, but in the broader sense, we're going to be talking a little bit about how all of us understand culture differently. So we're going to try to work towards a collective understanding of culture in a way that we have some shared language to talk about that. Then we're going to move to some of the elements that contribute to form us in terms of being cultural beings, not to be redundant. Then I'm going to highlight some insights regarding cultural traditions and our understanding of culture. And then I'm going to get to a cultural exercise. And so just a warning, if somebody wants to be a volunteer, already start, feeling like you're going to come up front. All right, wonderful. So we're going to already enlisted our volunteer, and that's fantastic. It'll be painless, I can assure you. And then we're going to be moving to the conversation between cultural traditions and interpretation of the Bible text. How does our cultural tradition impact the way we read the biblical text? And then hopefully, if we still have time, we're going to get to how do we think theologically about this whole situation. Does that make sense? All right. Now, for decades, we've been talking about culture. Sometimes people just touch the word, and all of us, or the person using the word culture, assumes that we all agree on what that is, right? And with the increase of telecommunications technology, cultural elements, or what we call material culture, is ever so accessible to us. Has contributed to the shrinking of the world, but also has contributed to, used to be the case, that if you wanted to get to know a cultural tradition, you would have to fly over to that place and visit and then be with the people there and then become familiar with it. That doesn't happen anymore. Now, those people from those places are coming to your region of the world. And you also can just go on YouTube or any kind of platform and watch videos about those cultural traditions. And in many ways, you can learn about those cultural traditions from the comfort of your home. So you don't have to leave. And so, in many ways, we are caught up in this trying to understand what it means for us, the role of the cultural tradition. And so, entire books have been written about it, and including that one. I don't know the author, but I hear that he's pretty good at it. But a lot of books have been written about how does cultural tradition, or how do cultural traditions deal with the question of approaching God, reading the biblical text, theologically, how do we think about this question, and so on and so forth. You might have noticed earlier when I had the title that I put the language of, or I used the label or the word culture in quotation marks. You might have noticed that. And I'll tell you a little bit about that. But part of the reason why I did it is because there are lots of words that are used to talk about culture in other languages. And more often than not, they don't mean what you think it means. For many people in other places, culture, the word culture, or the translation that they do relates to rules of social engagement, which is usually how we understand it. But it also connects to intellectual capacity. And it also relates to questions of knowledge, different spheres of knowledge. And in other contexts, it deals with the question of civilization. One of the general understandings in some of these translations is that culture means way of life. So the word, this word culture means a number of different things, which already puts us in a little bit of a quandary, because then when somebody uses the language culture, we at least have to ask, what do you mean? What are you trying to say? And so my hope today is that we can engage that. Now, when I put the word culture in quotation marks, it's because the language of culture came out, or was the effect of the colonial empire. When Europeans went out of themselves to conquer the world, they noticed that other peoples got at the world, thought of the world, understood the world differently, and then they started to use the word culture. So it became a category to think about other peoples, but not about Europeans themselves. And so by the time we get to today, the language of culture seems a little bit slippery, so much so that for those that are part of the Western or Euro-Canadian tradition or ancestry, for them, culture, next please, is something evasive. So even as far as 1992, Carl James did a whole study and interviewing students and people around Canada on what was their culture. And what he noticed was that those people who were Euro-Canadians had a difficulty identifying their cultural tradition. But they had no problem saying, that is Chinese culture, that is Latino culture, that is so on and so forth, right? So what I want to invite you to think about today is that we all are cultural beings. And so hopefully, we can work together in thinking about some of the aspects, some of the characteristics of our own cultural traditions. So put on your cultural hat if you have one or are aware that you have one. Or if not, try to imagine what that means or what that looks like, because I think it's important for you to begin to think about yourself as a cultural being, because that changes and will change the way you interact with other people, as well as you interact with the biblical text, as well as the way you interact theologically about your faith. Okay? So let me stop there just for a second and ask you, am I making any sense? Do you have any? Thank you. All right. That is definitely your worldview, but not just your worldview. And so we're going to get to that. One of the things that happened out of this project of colonialism was that Europeans look at the world in this way, right? And most of the world thinks of it in terms of cosmovision. Cosmovision, or a vision of the cosmos, which is different, you see? Because we don't just look at the world, we are within it. And so our cultural traditions are that stuff, and we're going to get to that in a few seconds, that stuff that helps us interact with the world in which we find ourselves. It's not just how we look at it, it's how we interact with it. Yes. That, all of that included. Oh, sorry. Can you repeat it before anything? So one of the things that you're mentioning is to look at where we are, how we connect, and how we interact as a society, right? And my comment is absolutely, it includes that. It includes something else too. So we're going to get to that and build on that as we collectively raise some of those characteristics. Sounds like a plan? All right. So can you help me out by reading with me the following? And if it is too small, I will read it out loud just for those that are in the online or for everybody else. In the kitchen, one afternoon, with her mother, Pooja asked her why she always cut the bone off the ham. I don't know, she replied. That's the way my mother did it. Later, Pooja's mother asked her mother why she always cut the bone off the ham before she cooked it. That's the way my mother did it, Pooja's grandmother replied. Later, Pooja's grandmother asked her mother why she always cut off the bone off the ham, and Pooja's great-grandmother said, I cut the bone off so it would fit in the pot. Okay? So hilarity aside, this small story illustrates for us a great deal of what cultural traditions are like and cultural dynamics, how they function, right? So my question to you is, what are some of the things that you find here in this little story in terms of cultural traditions or cultural dynamics? Yes. Carried by word or mouth and deed, all right? Right? It's not something that you get a lesson on, right? But it is a spontaneous exercise, a situation that emerges that then serves as the educational moment for you to learn from. What else? Right? We do it that way because we've always done it that way, which means we do it uncritically. We don't even second guess it. We just do it. What goes into that is that we trust. There is a relationship of trust between the person who is instructing us and ourselves. That what they're giving us is worth trusting, right? We're not thinking, I wonder if that's the case. I'm not sure about that. No, I'm going to reject it. It does happen, by the way, but we're going to get to that, hopefully. All right. What else do you find? Yes, absolutely. That's part of not being critical, right? You don't ask. And here, there is a little bit of curiosity. Why do you do it? All right. Sometimes they're just simply not curiosity. Yeah, all right. That's the way it's been done. I'm gonna do it. And you just go about it. All right. And later on you figure out, maybe I shouldn't have done that. But when okay, we fix it, right? But so that dynamic takes place. Yes, please. Right. So it's part of our quotidian activities, our daily ritual, those things that we do every single day. When we get up, when we go brush our teeth, when we go to the washroom and clean ourselves, when we take a shower, when we go out to our jobs, when all of those things, those are part or fraught with cultural dynamics, cultural elements. Okay, so we're going to get to that. Yes, I think. Yeah, right. And thank you. Which means then that oftentimes the passing down, in your case, program aspect for the younger generation, let me just say it, it often is passed down from generation to generation. I hold up to this because my ancestors taught me this. My mom or my dad or my grandfather or my grandmother or somebody in the community taught me this. And so you carry it, all right? So there is generational interaction. It's been passed down from generation to generation. So think about those as aspects of cultural traditions that we all carry. I'll let you in a little bit, Pam. It is an activity as well, which obviously sometimes carries an explanation or deserves an explanation, especially with the younger generations. And oftentimes you might find that sometimes we find this headbutting between the younger generation and the older generation. I don't like the way you do things. I don't, and you find, and then what happens in that tug of war is the emergence or the transformation of the inherited culture, and it mutates into something else that is more acceptable for the younger generation. Okay, and we already mentioned is unquestioned, right? Ham, please. Yes. Yeah. Correct. Correct. Yes. Absolutely. Culture, in terms of calling somebody white or calling somebody, as you say, Pam, having a Scottish and Welsh background, or me, uh, people see me and the first thing they say, oh, he must be Latino. And where were you born? That's like the kind of a knee jerk reaction, right? Because I couldn't have been born in Canada, right? Right. Because for some reason, right? It happens, right? And and I think what happens is that one of the important aspects here when we talk about culture is that culture is a social construct. And that just as a social construct, no, not yet, not yet. As a social construct, uh, culture is used as the material for us, kind of the guide for us to view the world. In the case of labeling, racialization, we're talking about colonialism. We're talking about the establishment of a hierarchy of ethno-racial groups, whereby those that are quote unquote white are at the top of the food chain and everybody else is below it. Because at some point, Europeans, Western Europeans, and Euro Canadians might have thought that they were the ultimate expression of humanity. So everybody was aspiring to become. And in many cultural groups, that is still true, that people aspire to, to mirror what they see as the ideal, right? But that is a social construct. Even whiteness, thank you, Pam, for that, is a social construct. Whiteness is not lack of cultural tradition or the absence of cultural tradition. And whiteness is certainly not devoid of its own color, quote unquote. Whiteness is a color, white, right? But during the 18th and 19th century, beginning of the 19th century, whiteness had a very specific meaning. The Irish were not considered white, neither the Italians, right? And we know that there were internments for the Italians during the Second World War, and also the Ukraine. Right? So we have to think about whiteness as this part of the colonial legacy monster that has been shaped over decades, centuries, in fact, that now can no longer be sustained. Because in fact, is an obstacle to our capacity for engaging interculturally. But we'll get to that. Well, I hope we get to that. Part of the complexity of having different cultural traditions is this conversation. And I have already mentioned the whole issue of generational tensions. When I was a pastor, I used to have a group of young people who were born here from Latino parents, first generation, so they were second generation. And I came here when I was young. I was able to relate to them, but there were areas that I just couldn't relate to them because I wasn't born here. See? But there were also areas in which I couldn't relate to their parents because they were too square for my own religion, okay? And so what I began to experience is that when folk migrate and go to a different place, and it doesn't mean just moving to another country, it can be just moving to another province in Canada because it's so incredibly large and so incredibly diverse. You go through a process of enculturation in which at moments you find yourself in an in-between space, not fitting in anymore in the culture or the tradition that you came from, and not able to fit in the new cultural tradition or group where you have arrived or become. And it takes years to actually be able to fit in. I don't think you ever do, because I still, after 34 years, I still don't feel that I fit in. Well, at least I'm reminded every so often by somebody, that, right? Whether I was, where I was born, or whether I have family in another country, or interesting accent that you have in English. So there are multiple ways in which that is manifest. But it's the kind of assumptions that we bring that is informed by social media, by the cultural tradition that we're part of, by the relationships that we the people we interact with, and so on and so forth. All right. Okay, so let's move. Let me then say, just for the sake of the conversation, that when it comes to thinking about cultural traditions, let me just say the blanket statement: all human collectives and individuals engage in cultural activities. And that also includes the construction, the creation, and I actually should correct that, the co-creation of cultural elements and traditions. Culture is not something that you create yourself by yourself. It is always in relationship with someone or with a community or with a set of people, with a group of people. That also means then that culture then provides us with the necessary interpretive tools, that is, the know-how for decoding or decodifying human existence. That is, the interconnected web of codes utilized for understanding and making sense of our world. That sounds a little bit too computer-like. But before we had the internet, we had cultural traditions. And cultural traditions provided us with those ways of interpreting the world and interacting with the world that is usually called socialization or culturalization. And that is how we learned what things mean, right? So that is an important thing for us to have. And if we move to the next one, I also want to say, and here is where not just about the earlier comment about how we are in a society, let me just say that it is then the ubiquitous or the ever-present phenomena that define, shape, condition, and impact the way we engage life, interact with our immediate environment, interact with each other, and interact with the divine. That's how large and far-reaching is cultural tradition, your cultural tradition. Okay? It means then that everything that you do has a cultural significance, however mundane it may be. It carries a weight so that when you do something, that which you do has a particular meaning that was passed down to you by way of your generations or in school or with your friends and so on and so forth, and you learn it as the thing to do. And when somebody does it differently, chances are you'll go, can't believe it, they do it like that. They're not supposed to do it that way, right? Well, nobody here does that, right? But at least sometimes I do, okay? But it is important to think about this because culture then is about the complex and constantly changing processes of culturalization inherited from generation to generation, which regulate human behavior. Being very intentional about regulate human behavior here, and includes all aspects of life, including our language, our epistemology, that's a big word, sorry for that, maybe our modes of knowing, our rationality, and here I mean the way we think, our interpretation of our own emotions, our own imagination, and the way we are socialized to think about life and God. So when you were a kid and you were crying, somebody told you that you were crying. You were not born with that information. When you were sad, you didn't even know what that meant. You just felt something in the pit of your stomach or something that made you down, and somebody interpreted for you. Oh, so you're sad. And then you go, oh, so this is what sadness is like, right? When a kid is born, one of the things that kids do is what? Cry. And the second thing? Yeah, that too. But I was going to go, that's just funny. The other thing is eat, right? But in order to get fed, they don't tell you, I want to eat. They just have this anatomical need, biological need that need to be fed, right? And when they start being able to talk and understand, they're told, oh, you're hungry. And then you start learning the processes and dynamics and codes. Oh, so that's what it means to be hungry. Oh, all right. So when I have this little bit of a ache on my belly, maybe is that I am hungry. All right. Okay. All right. And so you grow up beginning to identify, and you pick those up. You don't question them. You just take them and you begin to build that which is your cultural understanding, right? And you only know that it is your cultural understanding when you encounter somebody who is different than you. Right? Oh, so you like tortilla, not bread. I never had tortilla. What does it taste like? And you might go and, if you're curious enough, you're going to go and eat it. It's a little bit chewy. Maybe I can put a little bit of ketchup on it to add some flavor to it, right? And a Latino comes in here and said, can I have a steak? And one of the questions they're going to say is, so why don't you have something like chimichurri or tomato sauce to put onto the meat? I mean, you got to have some to give it some flavor, this thing, right? And that is all because we understand the world differently. We have inherited this differently. So let me stop there for a second, because what comes is what I hope is a little bit of fun for me. Not for you, maybe, but for me. Are there any questions or comments? Yes. Right. Sweet Lord. Yeah, that's one of the questions that I was praying to God to please help me so that nobody would ask. But I guess my prayer wasn't that effective. But I think what happens is that when the colonial project came out and structured the world around a racialized hierarchy of value, whereby those that were of a specific hues and tones of skin were of a lesser value, that carried through in the construction of some of the societies in what you would say the West, the Western European Anglo-North Atlantic. Canada is a good example of that, right? Where less value was assigned to the indigenous communities, less value was assigned to multiple other groups, including Irish, Italians, right? Who today would probably say we're white, right? So that has moved a little bit. I wouldn't say that today we are back at the moment when we have ascribed that. I think what is happening is that these communities themselves are exercising their own agency in naming themselves. So it's no longer just about, you think I'm a Latino, but I like actually the language of Latino for very clear reasons. And I could go on a whole explanation of that, right? And so I think during the 60s and the 70s, the liberal Christians wanted to change the world, and we should change the world, and fantastic goal to have. The people that were missing were the very people they thought that we were representing. Had they engaged the racialized and minoritized groups, the conversation would have been a very different. So as we think about changing the world, let's make sure that the very people that we think we are changing the world for are there with us in the conversation at the table, sitting at the table and having a say so. Because that will change the way we structure our goals, the way we think about our approaches, the way we structure even our church, all of those things put together. Right now is not so much about quote unquote color, but about the processes of racialization, whereby those that are part of this whole range of cultural traditions are considered to be racialized, and those that are part of the Western European Anglo-North Atlantic are not considered to be racialized. So that connects directly to your earlier question about whiteness, because whiteness also goes together with being not racialized. So that's part of the conversation here that I want to emphasize. If we were in a different place, we could move to the next slide. We would then have a whole exercise about, can we go to the next slide, please? We would have a whole exercise about knowing ourselves as cultural beings, knowing your context as culturally conditioned, and also being able to identify your own biases, cultural biases, and prejudices. And I don't mean biases and prejudices in a negative sense necessarily. It's just simply that we all have a different value system out of which we're operating. And when we see your prejudice towards coffee and not tea, okay? Your prejudice to cream, not milk. That's kind of what I mean. That you exercise your own criteria of choices, right? But in cultural tradition, you also do the same. You are also predisposed by your cultural tradition to choose, to opt for certain things and not others. So I'm going to show you some images. Sorry about that. And my hope is that you help me identifying them. Oh, move too quickly. Okay, that's good. Let's stay there. And what I'm asking you in this particular slide is, can you tell me where those pictures are from? Well, what location, geographical location do they represent? Did it come from? Just take a stab at it. At the moment you see it, what's your knee-jerk reaction? Brazil, all right? One to the right is, okay, care to narrow it down? Bingo, we got a winner, all right? Detroit. All right. There is no prize for you, sorry. But how about the one to the left? Manila? No? It's Asian, but not Thailand? Sorry? Mumbai? No? Sorry? Caracas, Venezuela. Wow, nice choice, but no, it's not. So I'll let you in on it. It's Tokyo, Japan. It's one of the suburbs, one of the slums of homeless people. Okay? Now, I want you to think about this. As I ask you, you had your knee-jerk reaction to name places. because you already carry preconceived ideas of those places. That exhibits, puts on display your own cultural assumptions and biases. You see what I mean? Yes. Right. But that's precisely the point. That there are certain assumptions that we make. Yeah, no, Canada would never have a place like this, right? Yeah, try go to Toronto and try to see whether there are homeless people, whether there are people in tents lying around, spreading all over the place. And then you tell me whether Canada reflects being wealthy, right? You're going to find a lot of places like the one here in Detroit, a lot of rundown homes. I'll get you to that. A lot of rundown homes. And you can easily think, yeah. No, the United States, no. Because what you see in the news, what you see in television, in the shows and everything is the opulence, the wealth, right? Unless it's a specially designed, show or episode that makes a point of doing that. But that is because in your cultural tradition, you have already been informed and conditioned that this kind of poverty can only be in certain places. Those are your cultural biases and prejudices in the best of senses. So I'm not judging. I'm not putting judgment to any of that. Okay? Yes, please. All right. So two things. One, you think that it is, yes, I'm on my way there. You think that it is improbable that could be anywhere in a place where there is a lot of wealth, statistically, right? But so you're saying that it is less likely, statistically, that may appear in a place where there is more resources, right? And of course, more the case in a place where there are less resources. Yeah, sure, absolutely. I agree with you. But we're not talking about necessarily statistics as much as what actually happens when our cultural tradition confronts us and hits our brain. And once it hits our brain, it stays there unless we actually experience something different. And what I want to encourage you to do is to get it out and expose it for what it is. Oh, that is one of my biases. The same thing happens in the following image. If we could go to the next image. Great. Can you tell me where they're from? All right. So they look like they're from the United States. Anyone else? And now I don't feel afraid now. What if I'm not going to hit it, right? Sorry? Could be indigenous, you're saying? Could be yeah. Could be Vancouver, right? And yes. To El Salvador, right? They clearly, so thank you, Jim, for that, because it's a very telling. They clearly look like. And that's what we're talking about. They clearly look like those folk who Trump took and has deported to the prison in El Salvador, right? That means gangsters, right? That they clearly look like that, right? And what I was trying to make an emphasis on is that they look like that. So this is how fraught our looks, when Our gaze is. When we place our eyes on someone, it's not an innocent gaze. It's already fraught with a range of values, perspectives, prejudices, and biases of which we are not aware because we haven't taken the time to take them out, to expose them for what they are. They are just perspectives. They don't describe the real world. See, I'll tell you in a second where they're from, but Pam. Absolutely. Right? Yeah, correct. Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. What I want to say is that even just to look at them and think of them as gangsters is a real prejudice as well. Because we have already looked at this image and imposed our view on it. Hmm? I want you to think about this, how this works. Because when you're walking out the street and you see somebody who is from a different ethno-cultural and racial community, even sexual orientation, there is already a cultural baggage that you carry with yourself that conditions how you behave. In some cases, you might feel fear. You may look at them and, ooh, oh, I better go in a different direction because they might do something to me. And they might just be somebody who's just doing their own thing. But that's how it's been impressed upon us. Just so you know, they are from Bangkok. And they call themselves Mexican gangsters, but they absolutely have nothing to do with crime. They just like it because of the cultural look. They like the tattoos and the whole garb that comes with it. No, well, they have a connection in the sense that they find it inspiring for them to express their attraction in their bodies, but no international criminal connection whereby they're moving drugs or anything like that. Absolutely, came out in the newspaper. All right. Yes. Well, you would think, and this is why I like to use this image because there are a whole lot of Latinos that look like that. And so, again, we make a whole lot of speculations, right? Oh, yeah, you're Latino for sure, 100%, right? Or you're Asian. And the problem with you are Asian is Asia is such a big place and so incredibly diverse. Just like whites are so incredibly diverse, all right? Anyway, let me do a third image. Is that all right? And here, oh, got ahead of me. Got ahead of me. But all right. What's your knee-jerk reaction? I just want you to what's your knee-jerk reaction? KKK. US. Yeah, well, we're not. You see how specific you get, right? Yeah. From the US to Georgia to very specific, right? South of the Mississippi. I mean, you could go all in, all out. And that's your knee-jerk reaction. That's what the media does. That's what cultural socialization does. That it admires your capacity to see. What if I told you that they are people from Spain, Seville to be more precise. I took the picture myself, so kudos to me. But I took the picture because this is a picture of the most devoted people during Easter week. You see how different? The meaning is significantly different. Those that are in the picture are themselves devoting themselves and making a vow that in the rest of the year, they're going to live a life that is honorable to God. Those that you were mentioning earlier couldn't care less about that. As far as they're concerned, they are at the top of the food chain. And then the more we get rid of those people we can get rid of, sweet. Okay. So your knee-jerk reaction is once again the result of your own processes of culturalization and socialization. So how you view the worldview, how you interact with other people, and how you interact with the divine. That is how large your cultural tradition is. Let me stop there. Well, no. My volunteer, something like that. Could you please come, Peter, up to the front? Sorry? Easter week. Yeah. I was at the event of Easter week. I was doing some research in Seville, and I was really delighted that it was Easter week. And since they do that also in Guatemala, so I wanted to see how it's done in Guatemala and in Seville as well. So I thought, maybe they do it more of a low key thing, right? And to be, full transparency here, when I saw them, I cringed because I am also socialized that way. So I'm not accusing anyone. I'm just telling you how it operates in us, right? So when I said, I better take this picture and I better use it for educational purposes because it's very telling of our own conditioning. There is a procession. Ahead of it is a procession of the crucified Christ, and some of them are carrying it. And these people are behind, walking at the pace of the procession, and then they take turns. And what they do is, and they take turns to carry it as a promise that as they are taking this, they're offering their vows to God. All right. So before we take a break, because I'm sure you want to have a break, so let's just do this because I think it's important to do this. And as we do this, we're gonna do it, and then I'm gonna release you to your break so that you can think about it. All right, Peter. First of all, thank you so much for offering yourself. I promise it's not gonna hurt. So, what I need you to do is to please get your hands in there. This is flour, by the way, cooking flour. I promise you, has no yeast, so that your hands won't go bigger. Okay. Get it all into your hands, please, as much as you can. Nice. I love this. All right. That's it. I will not tell you to hug me because that wouldn't go well. And now I want you to grab this pair of scissors there. And if you could please cut this in a few pieces. I want you to think about what's happening in terms of the relationship between the flour and the scissors. Fantastic. Thank you so much. No, 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 I don't want it. All right. Thank you, Peter. Can we all please thank Peter? So think about that, and I'll see you in 10 minutes. All right? Yes, yeah, I think so. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, it is interesting.
Well, we all think we're open-minded. We all want to be open-minded.
Yes, we certainly do.
And then you're right about the knee-jerk.
I think I'm going to invite you to come back if it's okay with you. Now, usually when I am doing this can we lower the volume? Thanks. Oh, can you hear me? Yeah, great. Okay. So, usually I do this activity of the flower or with the flower with groups. And usually I ask everybody to get their hands full of flour and to hug each other. Just because I wanted to survive and didn't want anything happening to me, I decided not to do it today. But, and also because I wasn't aware of whether there was hardwood or carpet here. And I remember one instance when I did it I wanted to do it in a place, and the first thing they said, yeah, you can do it. And I was like, why? And they said, well, we got carpet. And so, okay, fair enough. Right? So as you saw Peter grabbing the flour and grabbing the scissors and cutting the paper, what are some of the insights that you learned from that? Wow, that's a deeper meaning that I had, but okay, all right. That's fantastic. Thank you so much. What insight in terms of the relationship between the flour and the scissors? Everywhere, right? I mean, was there a moment when Peter could have used the scissors without getting flour on them? No, right? What else? One item had nothing to do with the other. So the flour was entirely unrelated to the scissors, which are mainly a tool. Okay? Peter, what did you do after we did the exercise? Shake him off, and then you went to the washroom and washed your hands, right? Right. Now, unfortunately, when it comes to your cultural tradition, you can do neither. You just cannot bracket it out. You cannot suspend it and not use it. In fact, your cultural tradition is that thing that gets in your very porises of your life and that impacts everything you do. Just like the flour. So when you go and grab a hammer, just like when you grab a book or just when you grab the Bible, your cultural baggage accompanies you. And one other thing that hasn't been mentioned is that the flour is incredibly messy. You just can't control it. And for those that bake or do some kind of cooking with flour, know very well that even in your best of intentions, with your best of intentions, you just can't get a moment when you can cook with flour and not dirty the entire kitchen, right? Culture is also messy because it gets in every aspect, but it is also porous. Porous enough that when you encounter somebody from a different cultural tradition, you don't know when one culture ends and the other begins. And so when you encounter somebody from a different cultural tradition, what happens is a mutual exchange of cultural information. one cultural information, specifically Euro-Canadian or the dominant cultural tradition, may tend to impose itself on other cultural traditions, or may require that other cultural traditions might be suspended or left to the private sphere. That said, notwithstanding, I know that I carry my Latino-ness to the university, that I carry it with me all the time. That when you saw me today, you wanted to shake hands. In my tradition, you hug. Now, there are those that are, born huggers, right? They're just like to hug. Yesterday, when I saw John after we had a meal together, he went and he hugged me, and I was like, wow, I didn't know what to do with that, right? Because I was surprised, you see, because of my own preconceived ideas, my own culturally preconceived ideas, that Euro-Canadians do not usually hug, right? But that shows you, I'm just confessing, right? I'm opening up, making myself vulnerable. But seriously, all I am trying to tell you is, next slide, please, is that the cultural dimension, as I already mentioned, is porous, and it's also fluid. Next, please. And so when we engage someone else, there is a cultural exchange, but it's also a negotiation that impacts people's cultural traditions. What the United Church, I hope, started saying is interculturality. And that is to say, we change the content and the composition of our cultural tradition by virtue or to the degree that we engage people who are different than ourselves. So when you relate or you establish relationship with people who are just like you, your cultural tradition remains generally the same. But when you interact with people who are different from you in spaces where the both of you can express their own cultural tradition freely, then a great exchange takes place. Okay. Yes, ma'am. Right. Right. Great point. Just tiny little qualifier. I said Euro-Canadians, right? And that I believe you me, I don't tend to think of Canadians as a homogeneous whole. Yeah, and I was referring to John as a Euro-Canadian, and so, but just in case, Euro-Canadians, I meant, don't generally hug. And so yesterday when we met and we were saying goodbye, I thought he was going to shake hands, and then he went graciously and hugged me, and I didn't know how to respond. Admittedly, that was my own bias, right? So I'm not hiding that. But I am recognizing that there are specific ideas that I have about other cultural groups. So you're not the only ones. I am speaking about this thing, and I'm talking to myself as we're doing this. Yes. So you definitely want to extend the intersectionality to the fact that when women meet, your Canadian women, and generally, I imagine you're referring to your Canadian women, they usually don't just shake hands. They usually hug or nothing even. Well, generally among Latinas, what usually happens among women is that they give each other a kiss. You see? Yeah. Well, no. Well, yes, on the cheek. Yeah, I didn't go there, but yes, on the cheek, Yeah. Yes, Arabic women and Arabic men do it on both cheeks, right? So we have to see how it is that even just a simple thing, just like a greeting, bears a specific significance that is very different and ranges depending on the cultural group that you are part of. Okay. Next, please. So just to then close this section, the cultural dimension reaches and impacts all aspects of our lives to the degree that all that we do is interwoven with our cultural traditions. All that we do. And next, please. Therefore, then, there is no activity that falls outside the cultural dimension or the cultural framework that we use. And as I mentioned earlier, we just simply cannot shed it or wash it off or bracket it out. It's just part of it. Okay. Let's shift gear. Yes, Peter. No, not quite. Systemic racism simply means that in the social structures and systems are designed with the prejudicial attitudes that privilege a specific populations over other populations. That's what it really actually is meant to point to. Okay. So let's move to the next area. How about it? Since we've been talking about a lot of cultural stuff, and you're probably saying, "No, Nestor, come on, I had it with this. I need something new, something better, something more juicy." I thought that maybe we want to talk a little bit about the text and cultural traditions and biblical interpretation. Next, please. I want to first then say that the biblical text helps us see the centrality of cultural traditions or cultural dynamics in our very understanding of the relationship of the human divine relationship. Okay, so here are three examples. I mean, there are lots of other examples, but and we could spend the whole day, and what I'm giving you is something that I teach over a semester. So apologies for going so quickly. The first passage is the Genesis 1:28 passage, and I imagine all of you are familiar with it, with this passage where God is said to tell Adam and Eve, "Be fruitful and multiply." And how is that command known as? That is known among biblical scholars as the cultural mandate. Did you know that? Which is really interesting because even for those people that wrote the biblical text, cultural tradition or those aspects, cultural characteristics played a central role. But it gets a little bit juicier or The next passage is the passage of Genesis 3:21. Do you know what that is about? Adam and Eve are walking around. They have already found some leaves around there to cover their nakedness. They have already become aware of their own nakedness. They do not want to be exposed. Interesting information, because they wouldn't know if they were naked, if they had no cultural socialization, right? Interesting. But the text tells us that God said, they are naked. We're going to do garments for them. So God at the front of the fashion industry, okay? Okay? God is said to be involved in a central cultural dynamic and activity, which is to make clothing. So think about how the writers of, or in this case, the writer of Genesis is telling us that God was at the center of this whole thing, because that's how the author is imagining the interaction between Adam and Eve and God. Doesn't that sound fascinating? I mean, at least, maybe I'm just having a party and only inviting myself, but at least to me, it's really exciting, okay? And to me, it gets a little bit, scarier, and this is one of those things that happen in the biblical text, that you find these things. The following text, the one on Judges 12:5-6, is about the Gileadites and the Ephraimites being in tension with each other. Now, these two are considered to be part of ancient Israel. So these are clans that are at odds with each other. And they realize that the Ephraimites cannot say the word shibboleth. You remember this. You know what a shibboleth is? You know, when you can't pronounce a word, that's a shibboleth. You just don't have the ability. It took me years to say throne. That was a shibboleth to me. I couldn't. I would say throne. And people would look at me like, what? I won't tell you what other words. But in this case, it says that the Gileadites and the Ephraimites they were so alike to each other, they didn't know how to distinguish themselves in this war that they had at odds with each other. And one person figured out that the Ephraimites could not say the word shibboleth. They would say sibboleth, but not shibboleth. And so they would put a border patrol, and every person that was passing by, and I'm being 21st century here, everybody who passed by would be asked, are you Gileadite or Ephraimite? And if they were to say, oh, I'm Gileadite, they would be asked, can you say the word shibboleth? And that was the tale. According to the story, 42,000 people were not able to do it because they ended up dead. I'm not trying to do this to put a downer on you. But what I want to illustrate to you is that the differences between the internal differences of who is in and who is out in a social context such as ancient Israel was defined by who spoke with an accent. Think about that. So that cultural tradition has even that impact in the way we read people, even by the way they speak the language. Next, please. So what we find then is that also the cultural is not a separate aspect from human development. It's not a separate aspect from the construction of a society. That was to Marcia's comment earlier. is also not separate from inter-ethnic exchanges. And I go back to that, including how we view God. And so as a result of this, please next. In terms of engaging the biblical text, it's important for us to recognize that different cultural traditions interpret the biblical text differently. And that we don't have a corner. And by we, I mean all of us. From the different distinct cultural traditions that we are from, none of us have a corner in the way the biblical text should be interpreted, because different cultural traditions read the text differently. Next, please. One of these examples that I want to mention to you today is that experience of Jesus and the Samaritan woman. But before we go there, let me interrupt to see whether there are any questions or comments. Please. That gives me a chance to drink a little bit of water. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, you are correct. Not only did we inherit one text of the biblical text, but there are now a great array of options in terms of translations, or really many of them are no longer translations, but interpretations of interpretations, or or paraphrases of the text. Absolutely. We have this whole range of things, and all of those contribute to shape how we appreciate or learn to appreciate what's in the biblical text, right? I want to say that even if we had access to the original language, even then we enter into a process of translation. Because our cultural tradition is like our knapsack that we carry, our cultural knapsack. And that every time we're going to interpret a text, I'll see your hand. Every time we're going to interpret the text, we pull stuff, tools, cultural tools that we received from our cultural tradition that are all packed, filled with our cultural tradition that helps us engage the text. The risk is to begin to think, we have the right translation. We have the translation. That's where it starts getting a little bit tense. Please.
Understanding the New Testament, when I read other books that inform me about the life and times, say, of how things were back then, that I felt was missing in the Bible because they lacked enough context.
Right. And it also has to do with our own capacity to imagine, because we are so far apart from that context that even as we imagine how it was, which is what the images that I'm about to show you relate to, even as we think about that world that was then, we may just be off because we are bringing our own cultural tradition to bear as we engage the biblical text. Okay. Any other comment or question?
I would just comment that I think we also have to be aware that, so as an example, when you were saying, Genesis 1:5, Genesis 3, you know what they are.
Yeah.
We can't assume that someone
People might know it.
because we happen to be in a church that we know.
Absolutely.
Because I remember when Harry Meyer was here from VST talking about the prodigal son story, and he said to everybody in the room, "Well, you all know that story," and this person said, "No, I don't." Right. So just in church, just to point this out, this, but that we assume people know, but we can't assume people know. So then my question to you is, what is the right approach when to be open and inviting so that the conversation continues, as opposed to somebody has the power of knowing and someone doesn't?
Yeah. Retell the story. Retell the story. And connect it to some very today's quotidian realities. Not think that the text is stale and inactive and meaningless and is abandoned in the past, but that the text may have some relevance today, but it can only happen if we retell the story with information that today can help someone else grab onto it and say, "Oh, I did not know. Oh, this is fantastic. Oh, okay." And then establish lines of communication that were not there present when the conversation started. Absolutely. Yeah. And so that's part of the reason why when I told you in Genesis says, when they were naked, so I retold the story just in case, right? But recognizing the fact that in Canadian society, Christians can no longer speak from a position of privilege that they might have had at some point, right? Anyway, so, yes, Peter. Wow, we're getting on the question of divine revelation, divine disclosure. It used to be thought at some point, because of colonial perspectives, that the King James version was the first one, the all-out first expression. We today know that in fact was not the first one. It was certainly the Bible of the translation of the Empire, and because of that received a whole lot of attention. We know also that Luther had translated the Bible into German, and that there was also a Spanish version that the Jesuits had created as well, that out of which it came the La Reina Valera, that many people still use. Critical here is what do we understand by being divinely revealed? Because if we say that a text is revealed, does it mean that there aren't any tensions inside the text itself? There are no contradictions, that there are no, and that's a $20,000 question in conversation. Okay. Two, I know at least primarily evangelicals tend to think of the original Hebrew and Greek texts as the ones that were inspired, and that everything else is our translations, right? But even then, we only have access in the Greek. We only have access, the earliest one, I think, is up to the 4th century, the Sinaiticus, Codex Sinaiticus. But we don't have the earlier ones, and the ones we have earlier are only fragments. So it's hard for us to say, well, this is the one version, right? And miss the opportunity to recognize that the text itself is there for us to interpret it and engage it. so that it continues to be life-giving. So we're not in the, at least I don't want to be in the business of determining what is good and what is not good, but rather what is life-giving to the community that I'm part of. And what will help me be relevant to the community's challenges. So that would be my small comment there. All right. Yes, ma'am. Your understanding of?
My understanding of what is better, what is worse in different cultures happened when I was a child laying in bed listening to my mom and dad saying Welsh was better, Scottish was better. These traditions are awful. How come your family does this? How come your family does that? And I'm not putting them down for that. They're having a discussion about that. But I was quite little and I understood they saw something better or worse in each other's culture.
Yeah. It's important for us to, or what I hope I'm trying to do, or what I hope I'm doing, is to invite us to bring it to the forefront, to recognize that we all are, when we are embedded, we are like up to our necks or even totally submerged in our cultural tradition. Sometimes we don't even recognize it as a cultural tradition. And what I'm trying to invite you to is recognize that you are part or are work within and exist within a specific cultural tradition that has provided you with very specific tools of engagement. All right? And those tools of engagement are about to be shown, my hope is. All right? So let's go with the next image. What do you see there? This is from a medieval, this is about Jesus and the Samaritan woman. And the story of the Samaritan woman, you will recall, is about Jesus telling his disciples, you guys continue on, and I'm going to go to this place called Samaria. And then he goes and stops at a well. And there is a woman right at midday that stops there, and she comes and draws water out. And Jesus tells the woman, can you give me some water? And the woman said, how can you, a Jew, ask me, a woman, a Samaritan woman, to give you water when you know we don't relate very well? And Jesus says, if you knew who is asking you to give him water, you would instead ask him life eternal water or living water. I'm paraphrasing, by the way, just in case. Okay. But what I'm more interested in is what are some of the cultural artifacts, aspects that you see, characteristics in this particular image. Chrysanthemum. Right, this is a medieval depiction. Okay, so I want you to think about what are the cultural mores that are at play here. Yes. Okay, fair enough. It's a little bit too white, but so think about this, because this is a depiction about something that happened in the Middle East. Okay? This is an incident from the biblical text that happened in the Middle East, smack in the middle of the, and then at noon, which is so incredibly hot. Okay? So try to exercise your imagination and think about what are the cultural aspects that are emerging out of this, please. A lot of color and a very ornamental dress, right? Right? He's even disheveled, the guy, right? I mean, he, for all intents and purposes, he could be somebody who's needing some TLC, right? What else do you see? Yeah. And they're coming out of some kind of a fortress or something. There's a building, so something inside. There's just a walled city. Think about how medievalists were thinking, okay? Walled city. I mean, we have Quebec, right? Sure. Yes, Jim. Very much so. Okay? Can you please put the next one? How about that one? Now, that one, apologies for that, just in case. Think about the preconceived ideas that are being made here in this passage. And what goes in the way of interpreting this text. Okay? Because we're talking about an interaction between Jesus and this woman. Yes, ma'am. Sorry? I can't hear you.
It looks like the reverse from the other one. She's backing away and kind of like, and dressed like she's dressed, and he's leaning forward, very, very forthright.
He has been masculine himself, forward, right? She is deferent. But there is a moralizing of the story here. The exposed breast is a moralizing of it, right? Part of it is because in the story, it said, the woman said, I got to go to my husband. And she said, well, what are you talking about? The man with whom you are is not your husband, and you've been already with 5 men before that, right? And so when people read that, in this case, they might have already projected on their sense of morality or propriety, unique to their cultural tradition. What else do you see, please?
Looks like a little English village in the background with
Right.
a church, with a church
The whole
tower
city,
in it.
yes. Well, almost with a steeple. And it doesn't have a steeple quite like it, but it really does. It's a European city through and through, okay? So think about this, because this is how we interpret the text. We bring our cultural tradition, and the cultural tradition serves as the platform out of which we engage the biblical text, or from which. Yes. Well, yeah, that's one way to look at it, for sure. Another way of looking at it that he uses is part of the traditional way of looking at people who are devoted, that are acquiescing and passive, right, to what Jesus has to offer. And it coincide with the fact that this woman is, quote unquote, according to the image of questionable moral status, but Jesus is about to redeem her, right? So there is a whole lot going in terms of that is not explicitly made, but that is all implicit in the image. Notice, that in the previous one, there were a lot of chains, right? Something most likely was not going on during the time of Jesus. And here she's carrying this jar that is all made out of. It's a beautiful jar to carry the water. Probably was not the best tool to draw water out of the well, right? But we're talking about interpreting the text. All right? I'm going to show you another one, if that's okay. Please, next. So in the 2 previous instances, Jesus and the woman are portrayed ethno-racially different. And here, it's even more pronounced. The setting, which I would say is maybe even closer to the context of the Middle East, setting is different. What do you see here? Definitely. Is this the African savanna through and through? I mean, you're missing there the wild animals, right? But you can begin to imagine how this is imagined from a very different perspective, from a different context and setting. Please. Yeah. I mean, straight, right? I mean, this woman carries that thing. I don't think I could carry that. I can tell you that, okay? Because these things are heavy, right? But the woman is able to carry it. There's certain pride, even beauty and eloquence in her body as she's walking, right? And Jesus is the one that is portrayed as being more deferent. Now shifts the dynamics, offering something, right? Or being open to an interaction. Yes. And the other one here is like this, right? Yeah. So think about that too, because our cultural tradition teaches us how we express ourselves with our bodies, right? So one of the things that I learned when I came to Canada, and because I didn't learn it in Lubbock, Texas, one of the things that I learned here was personal space. Before that, I had no idea what the heck that was. Okay. I also have discovered, however, they have a very different way of looking at personal spaces. So some people of a specific cultures might feel that they gotta have a certain space. People are only allowed certain distance. I am not like that. I need a little bit more connection. I gotta be able to rub shoulders at least. I gotta be able to be closer to you, right? Because my understanding of physical space or even personal space is different because it's informed from my upbringing, right? And in Guatemala, when I was a kid, there was this saying that donde cabe uno, caben tres, right? And what literally means is where one fits, three fit, right? Because, we have a different understanding of space. Are you okay with another image? Please, next. Now, this is from India. Jesus, the Indian guru, even has a halo. So what it's doing then is highlighting that aspect. What do you see there? All right? Absolutely. Absolutely. The gender neutrality of the portrayal is really interesting, right? And only because she is the one with the rope, then you can imagine this is what she is the Samaritan woman, right? What else do you see? Buddhist, more Hindu tradition, absolutely. And the well is not just a well, right? In India, a well in many places can be also just a place of bathing. And so many people, especially when they go to the Ganges River, they walk down and then they bathe because it's just part of their religious activities. Right? Please, there is a certain leveling, right? And you only know that Jesus is considered sacred because of the aura, right? So there's a clear distinction here that is to be made, but is subtle, so to speak, right? Peter and then Pam. Next, please. And I think, Pam, you had a comment. Yeah, absolutely. Just in the previous, in the two other ones, in the African one and the medieval one. So can we go to the next, please? Yeah, not that one. Okay, sorry, it was loading. So my point here, though, is that as we read the text, we make specific assumptions about the biblical text. Our cultural tradition impacts us so much that even how we understand the Samaritan woman, even how we interpret the setting and what is happening, and even how we think about Jesus differs in great, significant ways. And so as a church community, our job is to always remain open to the possibilities of other people reading the biblical text. I want to point out, though, that my intention is not simply to just tell you, well, everybody interprets the text differently. My intention is to make you more aware of how it is that you exercise, that you put into work your own cultural tradition. And that in many ways, sometimes, the fact that we don't question or challenge or even ask the cultural questions is a legacy of colonialism. Because the indigenous communities, when the Europeans arrived, they thought the indigenous needed to learn to interpret the text like the Europeans. And we still haven't gotten over that. Because in order for them to do that, they needed to be turned into Europeans. And that meant to destroy their indigenous traditions, forms of knowledge, their own sense of the divine, and so on and so forth. It happened repeatedly across the globe, everywhere where the colonial project landed. And it is that legacy that is important for us to undo as we become more fully aware of our own legacy, cultural legacy, but also of our own role in this dynamic, in society, in church, in our jobs, and everywhere else. Sounds like a plan? I have one other thing to talk about, and that's how do we talk about this theologically. But I think it would be good for us to take a little bit of a break. Are you okay with that?
What time is it now? Sorry? Okay, so let's just take a 5-minute stretch and come back. We'll do that piece and some Q&A.
Yeah.
Is it okay?
Oh,
So
I
just take
have something else after
Yeah.
that, but yeah.
Take
okay.
a 5-minute stretch.
Yes, yes. I wanna do this other part, 20 minutes, and then we just open it for Q&A. Is that all right? All right. Thank you.
I was thinking about the difference in how art is so important in these things. In some ways, it'd be better to do text, tell it the story like you did, and see the art.
Right.
And we just watch somebody read.
No, that's right. That's right. Because our imagination is working.
I want to say something about this. You know, the other thing about this is that you can't, like, there's flour in this.
That's right. The intention is that when you cut it, you use it, your cultural tradition is going to move over to somebody else. Like you just can't avoid it. But that is also true when you interact with somebody, you and I. We are exchanging our love, for lack of a better word to say. And that's what is important here. To recognize that this interaction, this negotiation happens all the time. Even when or if we are not. All right. Okay. I promise that this part it will be shorter. I really would like to or hope to have a little bit more conversation, if possible. So I'll be quick. My intention in this third section is to highlight some of the theological ways in which it would be helpful for us to look at our cultural traditions. Okay. Can you go to the previous one, please? Before that, I just want to say that in light of what we saw in the images and everything, then people's cultural traditions then are the lenses with which we decipher, understand, and interpret the biblical text. That is a key insight that comes out of this. And the other one I mentioned already is that people's cultural baggage, understanding of the world, context, and culturally informed imagination influences how they view differently similar biblical texts. Okay, so those are kernels of insight. I hope you take them as kernels of wisdom. Okay. So next, how do we think about this theologically? So for the purposes of this conversation, let me suggest 3 ways. Next. God's self-disclosure, let me just start with that, or the moment, the incarnation event, places God at the center of this situation. Okay. Next, please. To the degree that God's self-disclosure or God's divine revelation, as many speak about it, show us that Jesus was nothing else than a first century Palestinian Jew. He was not humanity in generic sense. He was a full-blown human being with a cultural tradition, and out of that cultural tradition, he was drawing. So his teachings, his preachings, and his words that we have in the biblical text in the New Testament, those come from the cultural milieu that Jesus was part of. Okay. Next, please. So Jesus's self-disclosure of God then is fraught with cultural elements. In fact, we cannot think about God or God's self-disclosure away from or separate from cultural tradition, the cultural tradition from which he was, that is Palestine, first century Palestine. I'm reminded here of Gregory of Nazianzus, who said what he did not assume, he has not healed. And oftentimes we think about cultural traditions as containing a whole lot of terrible things. And I want to say, yeah, that may be. But I want to also say that the incarnation included also his cultural aspect. Okay. Next, please. And this is perhaps most important for me, is that our cultural traditions are about us being humans. Or say it differently, our cultural traditions are the ways in which we live our humanity. There is no other way. Now, since we cannot conceive human beings and human activity without the accompanying phenomena of cultures, then I want to recommend to you that we can say that people's cultural traditions are essential in enabling human beings to live their divine image. Now, we usually speak of we all are made in the image of God. How do we know that, right? What does that mean? And what I want to recommend to you is that one way in which we live that fact that we are made in the image of God is as cultural beings. So that there is an interconnection between us being created in the image of God and us being cultural beings. And it is our cultural tradition that prepares us, enables us, and moves us, energizes us to live our humanity in a specific way. So here I agree, next please, with Jacques Audinet, who claims that to acknowledge a person in their specific culture is a way to accept them as human beings. And that is to say that it is important that as we interact people from other cultural traditions, we open ourselves up to the possibilities that somebody else might have another view of life, of God. And maybe there is room for us to learn something new. Because that then, when we do that, then we engage somebody else's human imaging in our own human imaging. Yes, please. Well, that's a very provocative thought. I can see that you don't see colors, and that's part of the reason why you don't see colors. Make sense? Oh, okay. I misunderstood you completely. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Because in the moment when I don't see someone else as they are, right? The blanket statement that Pam was addressing with me, Canadians, right? Or everybody is human being. What are we caring about? So many people, races and cultures and all this, right? That comes out from a position of privilege. Because it's failing to recognize, I saw your hand. It's failing to recognize that the differences are what makes us phenomenal. So phenomenal that when we come together, we can have a party and really have a ball. Yes, please. Right. Okay. Surprisingly, it goes in this particular way. Next, please. Now, Klaus Schilder tells us that cultures are a complex network of elements that have as their goal to orient humans towards the service of God. He continues saying, humans engage in cultural activities for two fundamental reasons. One, in order to cultivate humans and their humanity. And two, in order to orient humans towards the service of God. I gotta be careful here because we don't wanna speak of it as many could tend to say that is the be all and end all of humanity, right? In other words, if you're not serving God, you're not living out your humanity. Because then we have to engage the question of what does it mean to serve God, right? And I think this is where there is an interrelationship between serving other human beings, our neighbors, our folk that are out there, that are marginalized and discriminated against, folk that are in great need, are an amazing way to serve God. So we have to qualify that statement. That said, it is important for us to think about how our cultural tradition cultivates us. Now, notice that word cultivate, because he comes from agronomy, comes from the land, comes from engaging the fields. Cultivate as if we are land, fields that is going to produce beautiful fruits. Coincides, interestingly, with Jesus' statement about you shall be known by your fruits. Anyway, I just made that up. So it wasn't part of my notes, but what do you know? Sorry. And the third point, if you please, for the next image, I want to highlight the event of Pentecost as the climactic moment of divine inclusion of cultural traditions. The affirmation to me is important of the event of Pentecost because everybody who was there was from somewhere else. They were not from there. And those that were from there themselves didn't know what going on was happening. Now, the event of Pentecost, if you don't know, is the event post Jesus' death where the people are together, the disciples are together, and they're praying and they're a little bit confused. Dang, Jesus was our Savior and he's being killed. What are we going to do? Right? This is the confusion that they're experiencing. And then they're praying on that day of Pentecost. And the story says that tongues of fire started falling on people, and people started praising God in their own language. And those that were looking at them said the following. Please, the next slide. In our own languages, we hear them speaking about God's deeds of power. Now, the amazement is that the people that were there were from elsewhere. And now they're hearing these people that haven't been trained on or hadn't learned the language, but they are also praising God. In the moment of Pentecost, there is this exceptional instance in which people begin to praise God in their own distinct cultural tradition, which goes back to what I said earlier. No one cultural tradition has a corner in the language of God, and no one cultural tradition determines what it means to praise God or worship God or even how to read the biblical text. Anyway, next, please. I think that is all. Okay?
So what I would like to do is just take maybe 10, 15 minutes of questions with Néstor on anything that we've talked about today as a way of clarification, as a way of something that you heard today for the first time. So just give you a moment just of silence, if that's okay. And then I'll invite people to raise questions, and I'll try to get there with the mic. So just take a moment of silence. Okay, I invite people to any questions you might have, and there's no such thing as a bad question. Sure, I'm going to go here because she hasn't spoken yet, Margaret.
Yeah, I don't know that it's a question, but it's just, I guess, an observation. Like when we often we don't realize the culture that our cultural bias, right? Like that we live in a culture is just like a fish lives in water. The fish doesn't know that it's living in
Yeah.
water, right? And so we live within our culture, not understanding what our culture is and what our cultural biases
Right.
are, right?
Yep.
And so it's not until we are engaging or come in, in community or whatever with someone from another culture that we start to learn
Yes.
about our own culture.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Your cultural traditions are formed in this space of in-betweenness and tension when we are exposed to someone else's map of the world and we compare notes and we recognize that our maps don't look the same, and even more so that maybe if we talk to each other, maybe we can put those two maps together and learn each other from it, right? So absolutely, thank you.
I'm just sitting here wondering too if we're not fighting our own, not fighting, but need to deal with our own hierarchical way of looking at ourselves within our own culture. That there is the lower, the higher, the richer, the poorer,
Yeah.
and that's part of what we deal with no matter who we are, that's what we see. And then we add different cultures into that besides that.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for that. There are sometimes when our cultural tradition also contributes to deal, or even our homes serve to deal sometimes feelings of inadequacy, of feeling less than. So that certainly happens all the time. And so there's this thing about trauma-informed conversations that is important for us to bring in and recognize that many times, many of our own insecurities are the result of traumatic experiences, both at homes or within the cultural tradition that we're part of, or as we engage with other cultural traditions, right? And so it's just important to recognize. My sense is that when we are presented with a hierarchy and we take it as acceptable and we reproduce it, then that's when things get a little bit problematic, right? And my invitation to you is to become self-aware of those, so how those have been handed down to you, and recognize that when you engage someone who is different from your cultural tradition, or who is different from where you are from, that those things are going to kick in, even when you least expect it, and even when you think, but I am a really good person, like I am very well-meaning person, right? And then, but it happens, and that's where I think developing the skills to identify it, and also developing the skills to learn otherwise, to unlearn what we learn and then learn new things, it's going to go a long way.
Yeah, this morning when I came and introduced myself to you, I immediately held my hand out to shake your hand.
Yeah.
And then later in your discussion, you mentioned that you would have rather hugged. And for years, I've seen that hugging from your tradition or other traditions that do that, and I really, really, really like it. I wished I did it more. But when I came to you this morning, my initial socialization
Yeah.
kicked in, and I reached out my hand
Yeah.
instead of the hug.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, absolutely. This is something that I had to learn in Canada, because when I came here, one of the things, John, would you come here just for a little bit? When in Latin America or in Guatemala, when we talk to somebody we touch, we have to make contact. We have to put our hands somewhere. Okay? And being at, thank you. Well, yes, why not? But being at the University of Toronto or being even teaching in university, I had to stop doing that. Because if I did that, could potentially be understood as an advance. You see? And so there was a sense in which I felt that I was losing something of myself, right? And part of it is because the structures of the Canadian, even the Canadian educational system, is deeply Eurocentric. So that even the way people interact is shaped and monitored, regulated even. But that notwithstanding, I am grateful for John's hug yesterday, right? Anyway, please.
I've just been thinking about how, we've got our Eurocentric culture, but then there's also the microcultures of, our workplaces or our church congregation.
Yes.
And how that interplays with personal values.
Yeah.
And just that, I guess I'm interested in your thoughts on how an individual's personal values may develop in contrast with or
Always.
with the culture
Yeah.
that they are exposed
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Our microcultures, I tend to think of them as subcultures because there is always the overriding cultural tradition. So you come into this culture, into this church, the setup already is from a specific historical perspective, not immediately, right? Second, what are the songs that you sing? Who were the authors of those songs? Third, what is the primary composition of the church, the ethno-racial composition of the church? What is the level of education of the members of the church? All those things speak about a specific cultural positionality, whether we want to or not. That's just simply the way it is, right? And so whereby somebody who is not part of that special sphere of relationships might feel out of place, right? And so the question for us as a church is to say, how can we carve out spaces where people who are from very different walks of life, different educational backgrounds, different perspectives, et cetera, can fit in our church, can imagine themselves participating, contributing to our church, right? And I mean, I'm not speaking about this church because I know anything. I really know nothing about this church. So I'm just using it as an illustration because I don't know about this church community enough to speak in any educated way. But that's what I mean. There is no doubt, even in our workplace, I work at the university. Everybody there, all of my colleagues have a PhD. So there is a level of conversation that we have, right, that I cannot repeat in any other context, right? So I have to think about it differently, and how do I engage people in different ways? And so we all have the capacity to interact and adapt. But becoming aware of the why we do it, that is the $20,000 question or issue for me. Yes, ma'am.
So, understanding our culture and what we have been, the flower we have been raised in, short of a bath, similar to what they were offered by Hitler as a bath, how do we slowly, as a groundswell, not even cleanse, because it's not cleaning, but how do we mix and add color to the flower that is our culture?
Great question. My answer is just two words: with humility. I wouldn't say add color because that's part of the what we've inherited. I would say add flavor, right? So And so this is not a corrective, just to recognize that red flour tastes different than yellow flour. You know what I mean? Than purple flour. All those are different flavors. They're just fantastic. That make life worth living in different ways ever anew. Right? And recognizing that all of that myriad of flavors are in fact part of the divine creation. So with humility, recognizing that we are one of the expressions of that beauty of creation. But there are many others that we need to learn and can we learn and can learn from. So that with humility, what I call cultural humility, or in other instances in the book at least, I call it epistemic humility. This is the humility of knowing that I don't have a corner in knowledge, right? So that's how I would say.
Thank you. Just in terms of the cultural humility, it sort of makes me think of that. You started out talking about decolonization, right? And in the context of reconciliation with Indigenous people,
Yeah.
that's what we're being asked to do,
That's correct.
right? And for me, this is an area that I've worked in for some time. And just going back to my previous comment, you know, that I'm learning about what my colonized processes and way of being and knowing have been ingrained in me,
Correct.
and then so it's caused me then, in terms of my path of reconciliation, is understanding what is the Indigenous worldview, like the Indigenous way of knowing
Correct.
that's different from this
Absolutely.
sort of colonized view that I didn't realize I had, and that I've been living in and contributing to
Yeah.
for all of these years. And just to give an example, you know, I worked in the area of Indigenous relations, and we would go to a meeting, and the meeting would always be late starting.
Yeah.
Right. And this was a very frustrating thing.
Conceptualization of time.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. The concept of time was very different.
Yeah.
And so you just sort of got used to it after a while and just sort of accepted it.
Yeah.
But it wasn't until I understood the reason for it that then I really got to accept it
Right.
and to understand it. And the reason was that the meeting would start from an Indigenous perspective. The meeting would start when people were ready to start the meeting. Right. And it meant that they could take care of whatever needed to be
Yeah.
taken care of, so that when they came to the meeting, they were present and they would be in the meeting, and the meeting could be productive.
Yeah.
Right. Or whereas I was there because the meeting was supposed to start at 10 o'clock.
Come on.
Right.
Right? Yes.
Exactly.
Yes.
So where is everybody else?
Yeah.
I'm here ready to go. But then, you know, with this different way of thinking,
Yeah.
then I realized, okay, in that meeting, if it's starting at 10 o'clock, I could be thinking about all these other things, right? That I that are going on,
Yeah.
that I didn't take care of
Correct.
before the meeting was
Yeah.
meant to start.
Great point.
So this coming together of understanding and the humility that you talked about, this is, to me, this is a key part of the reconciliation and decolonization.
Yeah. Thank you for your comments. Just to, if I could just push it even further, if that's okay. Just to recognize too that there is no such thing as Indigenous perspective. Okay? There are Mohawk, there are Cree, there are Anishinaabe, there's a whole range of perspectives, right? Just like we do with Asians or Latinos. And so that those kind of are totally reductionistic. Maybe because in the modernist perspective, the intention is to have a handle, right, of complexity. And what I want to insist on is that cultural humility allows us to recognize that it's incredibly complicated, right? But this recognition reorients us to remain open. instead of closing ourselves to it. Remain open to learning and grow, to learn something new that we didn't know before. Right? Talk about the concept of time. Talk about taste buds, how conditioned they are. Talk about emotions. Talk about how do you rear a child. I mean, all those are critical aspects of our cultural traditions. I still can do it with Canada's individualism in some contexts. I just can't, because I come from a collective context where we do things together. So we have a word for that, teología en conjunto, o pensando en conjunto, right? Or senti pensar even. So, and you probably say, translate that, please. So it's a theology together, thinking together, and even more, senti pensar means thinking with our hearts. So that we then begin to recognize how much we deprive ourselves of the beauty of learning from someone else's cultural tradition, and that can turn us into much greater human beings. That's my view.
I had the opportunity to thank you here earlier for what you've shared today, but I want to be just a little bit more specific. One of the things, and you just mentioned bang, 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 you just mentioned how do I raise a child? And there were a few things you just said there that just really resonated, and it brings me back to something I just want to thank you for very specifically, because we're in this space of cancel culture, makes everything opposite to each other all the time, whether it's good, bad, right, wrong, black, white, like doesn't matter, and it stops the conversation. It deprives of an enriched experience between people, communities, etc. And I see this particularly with my daughter. She's 14, and I get to enjoy every day being canceled for being a boomer, which I wasn't sure I was, and as if that's a bad thing. I mean, that, and I'm reminded on the daily that whatever I say, do, act is racist. Great, I'm up for the opportunity to talk about it. But what I'm taking away from you today, very specifically, is you said a line. It is not about right and wrong. It is about what is life-giving. And that I can take into my parenting, which is the most important job that this precious life of mine will experience. So I want to thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you.
Anybody else? Okay. Yep. Peter, I'll get you to yell.
Yes, absolutely. I would just change the wording. It wouldn't be about teaching them, but about living it. Because I just showing it may, and I think we mean the same thing, but I mean living it, because to me is, how do I carry my life in a way that things that I am learning become a second nature to me? So that next time it happens, I no longer have to worry about that. I've already unlearned that, and now I'm moving in a different direction. So that the reorientation that happens, that I think only when I live it and make it a habit of mine, then the other people are going to say, oh, interesting that you're doing this. Can you tell me, why do you do it? And then it gives you the crack opportunity. Well, this is the reason. And that's it. That's our job as both Christians, but also as human beings. Right. That's correct. And most likely you are learning as it goes, because you haven't figured it out. right? I mean, none of us. I mean, we are going to live it out, and along the way, we're going to mess it up like royally, okay? To have the humility to recognize and say, sorry. I just, that was wrong. I apologize. Let me try again. That, I think, is what living our humanity is about. Absolutely. Thank you. There is hope. One only caveat would be sometimes you got to be careful, and this is part of the humility. It is important to recognize that we may be part of the power and that we need to empty it. We need to name it, and we need to commit ourselves to profound change.
Okay, I'm going to thank you for your humility and your wisdom and your encouragement through your spoken word and pictures that you've shared, and the invitation for us to think about how we think and to think with our heart and our mind together. You've been a great gift to us. I give thanks for the light bulbs I've seen go on in this room, and give thanks that the light of God will continue to shine in and through you in your ministry and teaching, and through all of us as we leave this place to transform the world with love. So thank you, Néstor, for your time with us. And
Thank you.
I want to thank Nancy and Elaine again for their hospitality, to our tech team who are hiding back there, who've been very helpful to us. Most of all, thank you for saying yes in our baptismal vow. Will you continue to grow in your faith also? You've shown up, and I give thanks. And we'll see Néstor tomorrow at both the 9 and 10:45 service. So thank you for coming, and thanks. And we'll see you at the end of next month for our final speaker. So I invite Néstor to be at the front for a few minutes, but be kind to him. We want to be done at 12 o'clock, and he's put out for 3 hours